On a Sunday in the summer of 2026, Spain and Argentina will walk out to play the final of the World Cup. Around 1 billion people will watch. The trophy will be lifted, the streets of one nation will fill, and for a few weeks the planet will have agreed, almost completely, on a single thing to care about. And the organization that stages all of it, the one that owns the tournament and writes the rules of the game, has spent the last half-century being arrested, investigated, and distrusted in roughly equal measure. This is the story of how that happened. Not an argument about whether football is good or bad, just the history of how a small club of men in a London pub grew into the most powerful and most controversial sporting body the world has ever built. To understand FIFA, you first have to understand that the game it governs is not old, or rather, the kicking of a ball is ancient. There are records of a football match in England as far back as the 12th century. For hundreds of years, it was chaos. Whole villages would play against each other. Hundreds of people at a time, no fixed number of players, no agreed rules. You could shove, you could grab, you could sometimes ride a horse. The ball might be kicked across fields and through streets for a whole afternoon. It was less a sport than a moving brawl, and every town played it differently. Then, in the 1800s, something changed. The new boarding schools of England, places like Eton and Harrow and Rugby, each wrote down their own version of the game, so their boys could play it among themselves. The trouble came when those boys grew up and went off to university, or into the army, or into business. They all arrived believing their school's rules were the right ones. Nobody could agree on how to play a simple match. So in 1848, a group at Cambridge University tried to write one shared code, and 15 years later, on the 26th of October 1863, a lawyer named Ebenezer Cobb Morley called a meeting at the Freemasons Tavern on Great Queen Street in London. 11 clubs and schools sent men to a back room. They argued for weeks, and what came out of it was a single written set of rules and a new body to enforce them. They called it the Football Association. This is the moment modern soccer is born. The one big argument they settled, the one that split the game in two, was whether you were allowed to pick the ball up and run with it. The men who said yes walked out and went off to invent rugby. The men who said no had just invented what the world would come to call football. And the world learned it fast. Over the next 40 years, British sailors and engineers and teachers carried the game with them everywhere the empire and the economy reached, to the ports of Brazil and Argentina, to the docks of Uruguay, across the channel into France and Belgium and Italy. By 1900, it was an Olympic sport. Every country that learned it set up its own association to run it, and almost immediately, they started arguing with each other about the same old things: who was allowed to play, what the rules really meant, and who was in charge when two nations met. Into that argument walked a Frenchman named Robert Guérin. On the 21st of May 1904, in a building on the Rue Saint-Honore in Paris, representatives of 7 countries, Belgium, Denmark, France, the Netherlands, Spain, Sweden, and Switzerland, signed a piece of paper and created a new organization. They gave it a French name because French was the language of diplomacy, and the acronym stuck. The Fédération Internationale de Football Association. FIFA. Its job was simple: to govern football matches between nations. There is a small comedy in the founding. The country that had literally invented the game, England, wanted nothing to do with it at first. The English Association thought these continental clubs had no business telling them how to run football. England joined the next year, stormed out again in 1920, and did not come back for good until 1946. The inventors of the sport spent 4 decades pretending the world body did not exist. For its first 20 years, FIFA was fragile. The First World War nearly finished it. It had almost no money and not much to do beyond organizing the occasional friendly match between countries. What saved it, and what turned it into something the world had to take seriously, was one man and one idea. His name was Jules Rimet. He became FIFA's president in 1921, and he believed football needed a championship of its own, something bigger than the Olympics, a tournament where the whole world would send its best team and find out who was greatest. In 1930, he made it happen. The first World Cup was held in Uruguay, a small South American country that had offered to pay the travel costs of any European team willing to make the long boat trip. Only 4 European nations came. Uruguay won on home soil in front of 90,000 people. The trophy was later named after Rimet himself. From that moment, FIFA owned the one thing the whole planet wanted to watch. Through the war years, through the 1950s and 60s, the World Cup grew. Television arrived and carried the tournament into living rooms on every continent. The game exploded in popularity, but FIFA itself, the organization behind the spectacle, stayed small. It was a modest operation, run out of Switzerland, essentially a club of European administrators, polite, procedural, and not especially rich. It had a few dozen staff. It was respectable, and it was about to stop being either of those things. The year everything turned was 1974. The president, an Englishman named Stanley Rouse, had held the job for more than a decade and ran it the old way. But the balance of power in world football had shifted. The countries of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, where the game was now most popular and most loved, felt frozen out. They wanted more places in the World Cup. They wanted a say, and they had the votes. That year, they elected a Brazilian businessman named João Havelange. He was the first president who was not European, and he was not an administrator. He was a man who understood money and sponsorship and how to win a vote. He had campaigned on a promise to expand the World Cup and to spread its wealth. The only problem was that FIFA could not afford any of what he had promised. So Havelange went looking for cash, and he found it in the most consequential friendship in the history of sports business. Through a German executive named Horst Dassler, the man who ran Adidas, Havelange was introduced to the leaders of Coca-Cola. Together, Adidas and Coca-Cola became the first great corporate sponsors of world football. Havelange sold them the image of a global game played in every country, and they handed FIFA the money to build it. Sponsorship, as we now know it, was born. The World Cup grew. It expanded from 16 teams to 24, and then to 32. The tournaments got bigger, the audiences got vaster, and the money got enormous. When Havelange took over, FIFA employed roughly 11 people full-time. By the time he left, it was a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. The World Cup had become one of the most valuable pieces of property on Earth, and the way that money moved through FIFA, that was where the trouble started. To sell the television and marketing rights to the World Cup, FIFA needed a middleman, a company to find the broadcasters and the sponsors and collect the checks. Havelange handed that job to a firm called ISL, the International Sport and Leisure Company, founded by his friend Horst Dassler. ISL became the bridge between FIFA and billions of dollars in broadcast money, and somewhere along the way, a quiet arrangement took hold. The officials who kept the deal alive, the ones who voted to renew it, received a share of the money themselves. Not salaries, not bonuses declared in any report. Personal payments, in secret, routed through offshore accounts. This went on for years. It was the moment bribery stopped being an occasional scandal and became a built-in feature of how the organization ran. Then, in 2001, the company at the center of it all collapsed. ISL went bankrupt, drowning in around $300 million of debt. A criminal investigation in Switzerland followed, and it dragged the secret payments into the light. The investigators named names. The president himself, João Havelange, had received well over $1.5 million in payments from ISL. So had Ricardo Teixeira, his Brazilian son-in-law, who ran football in Brazil. The report was clear that these men, as officials of the game, should never have taken that money. It took more than a decade, but in 2013, with the names finally published, Havelange resigned his honorary position at FIFA. He was 100 years old. By then, the organization he had rebuilt had a new face and a new set of problems. His name was Sepp Blatter, a Swiss administrator who had been Havelange's right hand for decades. Blatter took the presidency in 1998 and held it for 17 years. He was a genius at one specific thing: keeping votes. FIFA was run on a system where every member nation, from Germany to the tiniest Pacific island, got exactly one vote for the presidency. Blatter understood that the path to power ran through the dozens of small associations with little money and big needs. He traveled constantly. He opened development offices. He funneled FIFA's wealth out to the poorer members in the form of grants, equipment, and favors. He built a block of loyalty so wide that no challenger could reach him. There were allegations of vote buying at his very first election, votes said to have been secured through African associations. Nothing was ever proven at the time. The pattern held. And then came the day that did more damage to FIFA's credibility than any other. On the 2nd of December 2010, the organization's executive committee gathered in Zurich and held a secret vote. In a single afternoon, they awarded 2 World Cups. The 2018 tournament went to Russia. The 2022 tournament went to Qatar. The Qatar decision stunned people. Here was a tiny nation in the Arabian desert with almost no history in the game. Summer temperatures climbing above 40 degrees Celsius, far too hot to play football. The choice was so extreme that FIFA eventually did something it had never done in 90 years. It moved the tournament out of the summer and into November and December, shredding the schedules of every professional league on Earth almost from the moment the envelope was opened. There were allegations that votes had been traded and bought to make it happen. Years later, Sepp Blatter said it himself. In 2015 and again in November 2022, just weeks before the tournament kicked off, he told reporters that awarding the World Cup to Qatar had been a mistake. A bad choice, he said, and he admitted he was responsible. He pointed to politics, to a lunch at the presidential palace in France, where, he said, pressure was applied to swing the French vote toward Qatar. Michel Platini, the great French player turned administrator, later acknowledged that his vote had changed after that meeting. And there was a cost that had nothing to do with football. To build the stadiums and the cities for the 2022 World Cup, Qatar relied on a vast army of migrant workers, drawn mostly from South Asia, employed under a system that tied them to their employers, that could confiscate their passports, that held back wages and sent men to work through the desert heat. Human rights groups documented the conditions for years. Thousands of migrant workers died in Qatar across the period of construction, from all causes, and while the number directly tied to the World Cup was bitterly disputed, no major sporting event in modern history had carried a human cost like it. Critics called it the deadliest event ever built. FIFA and Qatar pointed to reforms they said improved conditions. The families of the dead said they were still waiting for answers. Then came the morning that ended the old FIFA. On the 27th of May 2015, the organization's leaders were gathered, as they often were, at the luxury Bar Al Ak Hotel on the shore of Lake Zurich. At dawn, Swiss police walked in and arrested 7 of the most senior officials in world football. The United States Department of Justice unsealed an indictment, 47 counts, 164 pages, alleging that around $150 million in bribes had moved through the organization over 2 decades in exchange for marketing rights, broadcast contracts, and votes on where the World Cup would go. The charges were racketeering, wire fraud, money laundering, the language of organized crime, applied to the people who ran the world's game, and the man who made it possible was one of their own. His name was Chuck Blazer, an American official on FIFA's executive committee, a man famous even inside FIFA for his appetites for keeping an apartment in Trump Tower in New York just for his cats. Blazer got caught failing to pay his taxes, and in 2013 he quietly pleaded guilty, agreed to wear a recording device, and spent years capturing his colleagues on tape. He was the inside man who handed the Justice Department the keys to the building. 6 days after the raid, Sepp Blatter, who had just been re-elected to another term, stood at a podium and resigned. He was later banned from football for years over a secret payment he had authorized to Michel Platini. Dozens of officials across the world were indicted, banned, or both. The old leadership of FIFA was, in the space of a few months, swept away. So what actually changed, and when? The honest answer is that FIFA stopped being a quiet administrators club the day it became a marketing empire, and that day was the day João Havelange took over in 1974. Once billions of dollars began flowing through an organization that no single government could regulate, that answered only to its own members, and whose leaders were chosen by the very people they handed money to, corruption was not really a surprise. It was closer to a design feature. Havelange built the money machine. Blatter ran it. The executive committee voted for the tournaments. The 2015 arrests removed individuals. They did not remove the structure that had produced them. FIFA did reform, in the way large organizations reform when the world is watching. It set up a new ethics committee, rewrote its governance rules, published more of its finances, and elected a new president, João Infantino. And it kept growing. The World Cup will expand again to 48 teams. There has been open talk of holding it every 2 years. The tournament is bigger and more valuable than it has ever been. None of this requires anyone to stop loving football. The game itself is still extraordinary, and the World Cup is still the greatest spectacle the sport produces. What the history shows is something more specific. The body that owns the rules of the game and owns its biggest tournament was built by people who turned those rules into a business and spent 40 years trading the credibility of the game for the money it could generate. Whether that trade was worth it is a judgment the billion people about to watch the final will each make for themselves. But the story of how that organization got to this Sunday, from a back room in a London pub to a desert World Cup built by migrant labor, is the real history of the modern game, and it is worth knowing before you cheer.